Hello, I'm Eugene Reichel, Director of the Center for East European and Russian Eurasian Studies, or CEERES for short, at the University of Chicago. And I'd like to welcome you all to the CEERES Director's Lecture for this year. Today's event is sponsored by CEERES with generous support from the US Department of Education Title VI National Resource Center grants. We are sharing the link to our website and the chat box, and we encourage you to visit our site and sign up for our newsletter to learn more about upcoming events and our outreach initiatives. I also want to mention that to our audience that there'll be time for questions at the end of today's program. Please use the Q&A box found at the bottom of your screen. You can enter a question at any time during the lecture or during the discussion. Today's director's lecture, this year's director's lecture, is Anna Temkina, and the title of her talk is Khamstvo and Smiling, Neoliberalism Meets Post-Soviet Bureaucracy. Anna Temkina received her PhD in social sciences from the University of Helsinki in 1997. She is currently chair of public health and gender and co-director of the gender program at the European University at St. Petersburg. Her interest in gender studies and feminism began in the 1990s and later expanded to encompass gender, reproductive health, sexuality, feminist theory, and gender relations in Soviet and post-Soviet societies. She's the author of Women's Sexual Life Between Freedom and Subordination, published in 2008 in Russian, and Russia in Transition, published in 1997 in English. She's author and co-author of In Search of Sexuality, New Byt, Gender Studies of Everyday Life, Health and Trust, Gender Approaches to Reproductive Medicine, as well as a large number of articles, both in English and Russian, in journals including Current Sociology, Social Theory and Health, Critical Public Health, and Emotions and Society. And with that, I'm very happy to welcome Anna Temkina and hand it over to you.
Okay, thanks a lot. I will open my presentation. Okay, thanks a lot for invitation and for kind introduction. I'm very happy and it's proud for me to present results of my research and ongoing project. And so my presentation today is titled Khamstvo and Smiling, Neoliberalism, Meet Post-Soviet Bureaucracy. And what I am going to speak about today, this is a plan of today's presentation for you to know what I'm going to speak about. I will begin with description of Khamstvo as a Soviet cultural phenomenon and will explain what is this and why it is important. Then I will turn to gender and motherhood in Soviet Russia, why gender dimension is important for me in this presentation, because my empirical site is maternity care. Of course, this is a gender empirical site where neoliberalism meets post-Soviet bureaucracy. And my main question for today's talk is why Khamstvo is still there. I argue that Khamstvo could be conceptualized and empirically researched as a culture-specific communicative practice, but also shaped by a specific institutional gendered context. This is what I'm going to speak today, but I would like to begin with some story. My today presentation, this is a story which I wrote in my diary, in my field notes, when I was 1 month ago. I'm now on sabbatical, and I was in Russia shortly in May of this year. And this is a story which is just 1 month, happened 1 month ago, about Khamstvo in public interaction. The story was the following. I went to Bukvaet bookstore. It was almost empty. In the far room, I bent down to find the book on the bottom shelf. Out of the corner, I see a cleaning lady, and suddenly I hear her rude shouting, "Pull up your jacket." I guess my neckbag could be seen above my waistband of my jeans. And instead of shamefacedly pulling back my jacket, I am wondering how to say in Russian, "This is not your business." And I answer, "I like the way it is." She responds, "It's inappropriate." And then I approach administration to write a complaint about her khamstvo, abusive behavior. Such khamstvo is not so typical nowadays in Russia, and it may be a good example to start for the talk about khamstvo. So why this is important? Why this piece is important? First of all, in consumer context, in post-Soviet consumer concept, I meet Soviet type of communicative practice. This practice of evaluation of behavior, evaluation of display, and what I'm doing inappropriate. So what I'm looking wrong. So it's control and power, and of course it's gendered. Two women communicate in this case, and I guess that she considered me much more younger than she. I'm not younger than she, but she considered me, and so it was like age and gendered power included communicative practice. But in the context, post-Soviet context, as a client, I have a possibility to resist. I have a possibility to voice against such kind of behavior. So in new consumer context, there is possibility to resist to khamstvo. But this was not easy because I could not find words. I need the special efforts to understand how to react to such kind of behavior. So khamstvo is a special Soviet emotional practice of communication in the public sphere and service. This typical and legitimate practice is aimed at making the person feel shame, obey, behave correctly in the moral sense. Post-Soviet consumerist context is different. I act as a client, naming khamstvo and complaining about khamstvo. The new consumer subject problematized the practice, so it ceased being typical and new emotional style appear in consumer context. I call this style smiling context, smiling emotional style. Both emotional styles coexist in the public consumer space. Khamstvo from one side, but there is also competing regime of consumer-oriented smiling. My focus will shift in my presentation from this client-cleaner interaction to receiver providers in healthcare. I'm interested in institutional gendered context, special institutional gender context, maternity, hospital. And so I look from one side on khamstvo in cultural context, but from the other as a certain institutional and professional side. So khamstvo is a Soviet cultural phenomenon. This untranslatable khamstvo, as Dovlatov mentioned rumors about Nabokov, who in his lecture told that this term is untranslatable. Khamstvo is very difficult to translate, maybe impossible to translate. Special context matters. But nevertheless, if I will try to define this practice, communicative practice, then we could connect it to negative evaluation, disrespect, humiliating, causing shame and vulnerability, arrogance, rudeness, insolence, denial of the right to dignity, impunity, and so on. And there are at least several traditions, let me say. One is tradition in literature, especially in Soviet and Russian literature after October Revolution from one side, but also scholarly sociological tradition, even there is not a lot written in sociology about this subject. Early Soviet time, like novels of Alexei Tolstoy, Bulgakov, Zoshenko, description of new Soviet personality, constructing of a new personality with a new type of behavior, proletarian personality with another morality and with another communicative practices. And this is coincide with definition given by sociologist Matza, who says that Khamstvo is a flexible term having either a pejorative meaning of a lack of culture and manners that is linked to Stalin's answer to the intelligentsia, kulturnists, but also a positive meaning of soulful authenticity that resists Western form of false politeness associated with savok or quintessential boorish Soviet person. So from one side, it's Soviet proletarian authenticity, which is opposed to kulturnists, and from another side, it is opposed to Western consumerist false politeness. So Khamstvo is a cultural specific concept, and mostly when it is described or referred to, it will be either communication in a public space, which is connected to the control of behavior and display, as it was my case in bookstore Bukvayet. From the other side is power of gatekeeper controlling the access to Soviet service in the economy of deficit. And there is one quotation of Dovlatov, who wrote about his usual visit of grocery store in Leningrad, in Soviet Leningrad, waiting in the queue. And then, as he wrote, something strange happened to me. He mentioned that he began to use the special suffixes, speaking with saleswoman. And as here, I will read one piece of this quotation, and I pronounce all these diminutive suffixes, trying my best to please this lady. And so I bend in front of her in anticipation of Khamstvo, because she has a sausage and I do not yet. I talk my entire life just as obsequiously to anyone who we called of the service sector. So it's Soviet sector, it's typical Soviet practice, and it was in my first example about my own experience, it's approximately the same practice, but context is different. It's new post-Soviet context, different in a way. So Khamstvo as a culture-specific concept is a way to discipline, control, shame, and frame Soviet personality. This is a control of person as a moral subject, and if we will focus on shaming, which is also a mechanism of how Khamstvo is working in public ritual, it's described in different research already, for example, public shaming as emotional community bond, correction, and justice, reconstruction of justice, as Stevenson shown, subordinated subjectivity. People on the receiving end of the shaming experience feel themselves powerless, abandonment, and paralyzing fear. This is the mechanism how it's work in communication, in public ritual, or in service, or when there are gatekeepers in the economy of deficit. But my focus is a bit different. It's communicative emotional practice, what is important for me, and is a practice of institution, in institution, and in medical organization, in institution. And so context of shift described and discussed in contemporary literature of turn from emotional socialism to emotional capitalism is important here in sociology of emotion, when emotional capitalism is connected to calculation of emotion, rationalization of emotion, another evaluation of emotion, general rationalization of emotion. This is one dimension, and another dimension is institutional theories, which help me to analyze Soviet bureaucracies, Soviet paternalist bureaucracy from one side and neoliberal market from the other. And so my second dimension of my presentation, which is about gender. Why gender is important in my research? Because I will speak about maternity care and about Khamstvo in maternity care. And Khamstvo in Родильный дом, in maternity hospital, is very special and many time referred in empirical material which we collected about this. So as it connected to motherhood, and motherhood is a special dimension to be controlled. In every society, but in Soviet and post-Soviet society, there are special way of controlling motherhood. And so I will briefly describe three main important gender trends in contemporary Russia, which of course much more broader that I will speak today about, but for the purpose of development of my argument, it is important coexistence of neoliberal trend, moral conservative trend, and Soviet legacy. Within this, of course, they coexist. But if analytically we separate them from each other, then within neoliberal trend, women agency will be connected to consumerism and new consumer context, first of all. In moral conservative trend with traditional femininity, and within this context of Soviet legacy is the femininity for the state, for the sake of the state needs. And I will go into to describe all these three trends a little bit more. So neoliberal trend. Women as consumers want to have choice, and there is diversity in consumer society, and there are possibility of choice, including possibility to choose medical service. And middle-class individualism have high value within this trend, within this context, where real life is organized as a project. This means that it could be, at least ideally, calculated, rationalized. There will be goal, there will be resources, there will be means to attain these goals. Femininity within these trends became more egalitarian, more negotiated, and it also became a resource of individualization as well as motherhood as itself. As a resource, it's very high value of motherhood in Russia in any case, and it's also private, more private business-oriented motherhood and resource of individualization. And motherhood is individual choice. And so it's an attempt of individual control over reproduction, over pregnancy, over childbirth, over caring, and commercialization of contemporary, partly maternity care became commercialized in contemporary Russia, and this institutional process coincide to the trend, neoliberal trend of individualization, choice, and rationalization. Moral conservative trend, where women are considered to be moral target of proper moral behavior. Spirituality, special conservative term, is a global phenomenon, but in Russia there is a specificity in gender term, and with a special focus on spirituality and with a special focus of traditional femininity, traditional gender roles, destiny of women, and so on. And life is described, identified more in the style of emotional socialism than emotional capitalism. And life is just destiny. Life is like fate. It could not be ruled, or it could be ruled only to a very small extent. So motherhood within this trend is a moral responsibility, and it's the target of control over moral community. Of course, mother everywhere is immoral. moral target of moral control, but this is a special conservatively based moral community which presuppose moral control over sexuality, reproduction. Abortion is the most evident case which are permitted in Russia, but there are more and more restriction and even more and more moralization about abortion in contemporary Russia, and childbirth. And mothers are the target of normative disciplining. The Soviet legacy. This trend is connected to the lack of gender equality promotion. The law on gender equality was declined 3 times. In Russia, there is no law on gender equality, and there is no message from the state about gender equality. Of course, it exists because we had special emancipation for the sake of state needs, and it's, of course, Russian women are emancipated, but this is a very special emancipation, different from the West. Femininity for the sake of state needs, working mother gender contract, when motherhood as well as working roles are considered to be citizen duty. And motherhood, first of all, is a demographical concern, and demographical concern is the issue of national security, and it is state supported. A lot of benefits are given to mothers in contemporary Russia. So motherhood is a citizen duty, state control over reproduction, bureaucratic paternalism in maternity care, top-down control, rigid bureaucratic rules. Mothers, childbearing women are governed by the state-determined institutional order. And finally, how neoliberalism meet post-Soviet paternalist bureaucracy in maternity care. Here I will refer to my empirical work, which I did together with Daria Litvina and Anastasia Navkunskaya, and it includes quite different empirical data. We did it for 5 years and more. It's 1 year ethnography in maternity hospital. It's 125 interviews with childbearing women and health providers. It's text analysis of different websites and complaints. And the main question in this research was how is communication changes between women and providers. I will not speak about this, but my question is mostly why Khamstvo is still there, why under a lot of changes, development of consumerist context, neoliberalism, why Khamstvo is still there in maternity care in particular. And of course, this is a sphere of reproductive health, which is not only gendered, but it's also a specific sphere. It's very highly medicalized in Russia. And of course, a lot of feminist critique exists about medicalization of childbirth, but this I will not go into detail. So Soviet Khamstvo in paternalist maternity care, just one example, which is very, very typical. When women speak about Russian maternity care, for sure there will be some piece as presented here is on the slide. That professional communicated very often with childbearing women in a special rude style of humiliating Khamstvo. Not every time, of course, but it was very widespread and legitimate practice within maternity care. Woman told, I had a boy, first child, in 1999. In an ordinary, one might say, Soviet maternity hospital, where there used to be 10 people in the ward, and the approach to a woman, I don't know, not as one appropriate for a woman experiencing suffering, torment, some kind of pain. Everything is managed as it a conveyor line. Doctors shouted, Hamyat, at me. The doctors Hamyat, it is a refrain of such stories about Soviet maternity care. So it's considered by professionals, very special professional group, that ignorant women should be controlled. They should forced to cooperate for the sake of their own health. How they explain, they did not name such behavior as a Khamstvo, women did. But this is like special way of control, which is necessary if women are ignorant and don't know how to behave properly. So what's happened in the last decades? Ongoing reform of healthcare. They begin in 90s, and Michel Rifkin-Fish wrote a lot about this and continued now, especially under the health project, National Project of Health in 2006. And there are quite different directions of these reforms. They are very inconsistent, this reform. From one side, more market developed and patient-oriented healthcare is promoted and developed. So there is a choice, some choice for childbearing women right now for free, and much more choice if they pay. So it's became more market and patient-oriented maternity care from one side, but no less state-oriented. And here is like basic contradiction between market and state control. From one side, it should develop in the way of consumerism, like reacting on consumer demand, like raising money by themselves, money follows patient from one side, but at the same time, it's rigidly controlled by the state in the same way as it was controlled in the Soviet time, maybe even more, like this paternalist bureaucratic bureaucracy with numerous body. Every doctor told us in our empirical site about Sanpin, Rospotrebnadzor, Ministry of Health, investigative committee, Следственный комитет. There is different state bodies who often come to maternity care and control different indicators, control different kind of work of doctors. And so doctor told us, it's the chief of department, they told us that we should have about 30 journals, 30. It's a documentation which she could fulfill every day of her work, because for different purpose, with different indicator, with different criteria. And so there is like a huge, she even show us how it's look like this journal. Even there is a lot, of course, of electronic work to be done too. And they told with irony, Big Brother is watching you, mean doctors, that they are under control all their time. So inconsistent rule under ongoing reforms, systematic change, impossible contradictory requirement, they say, fine, inevitable, just accept this. There will be anyway inspections and will be anyway fines, and there will be punishment for sure. So helpless professional from one side and new consumer demands from the other side, dissatisfaction of assertive recipient of care. These individualistic, consumer-oriented mothers want to have good service, and so they press on maternity care, and they very often are dissatisfied. If they are dissatisfied, it led to emotional outburst. They complain, they write complaints to different state bodies, then inspections come, and then they fine and punish doctors, hospital, and so on. As a gendered side, maternity care, there is also different trend within, because in order to maintain condition as workable, providers, professional had to implement special strategy. And under influence of market, women as consumer have voice. They can complain, as I did in bookstore. So there is right now voice, and it's quite different from the Soviet time. And women expect comfort. They expect a smile. They expect new consumerist style towards them. And providers, in a sense, try to meet market demands of their consumers. On the level of state paternalist bureaucracy, women are considered to be ignorant targets of clinical and bureaucratic regulation, and providers embedded women in the institutional order, in the institutional rules and state needs to make them proper patient, proper citizenship. And on the level of moralization, women are touched of moral contract to be a proper mother, endure suffering, pain, and providers embedded women in the moral order of a proper behavior of mothers. And providers maneuvering between different emotional style in order to maintain institutional order. From one side, Khamstvo is a mean to subdue client, power exercising, top-down hierarchical control, disciplining and government clients, and new type of clients, which is much more difficult to discipline to compare with Soviet obedient patient. Through emotional expression, causing fear, shame, and feeling of inferiority, and morally limited the opportunity for childbearing women, good mothers to resist, enforcing morally inappropriate behavior. From the other side, there is emotional regime of smile, which means meeting new demands, prevented emotional outburst of new consumer client and their complaints, because childbearing women could resist, and they resist. I like as the way it is, as it was in my example. So how to maintain institutional order? There are some examples from my empirical work from our website, where we found that providers constantly maneuver between Khamstvo and smile. They constantly use tools from different emotional styles in order to prevent complaints, in order to maintain institutional order, in order to work under different pressure, from one side market pressure, from another side pressure of the state controlling body. So in order to maintain the institutional order, it is necessary, according to providers, to discipline moral subjects through the shame as bad mother by Khamstvo, not by special influence on them. And there is one mother online post. She told, midwife yelled at me so that I would not howl but breathe, like scolding a child, telling me what is the disgusting mother I was. Doctors threatened me that my child could be born an idiot. Also, from another side, to maintain institutional order, it is necessary to comply with state regulative rules, quite contradictory, and to force ignorant patient to cooperate by Khamstvo and smile, both emotional tools of emotional regimes are used in order force women to cooperate. So obstetrician tells, what can I do? How can I not raise my voice or not shout? If she never listens, obeys me. If they don't listen, if they do not obey, if they have their own opinion, then for doctors, the only one way is to shout, to raise voice, and to be rude. But besides this, providers accept that they should meet new consumer demands, prevent voice and complaints, and smile. Regrettable as it may sound, in order to sell yourself, you need to do something. You have to change a bit somehow. You need to learn and somehow control yourself. Learn to smile, to address the patient. So learning skills to smile and to sell themselves. Even professional mostly do not accept market ideology, but nevertheless, in a way, they accept. So now I come to conclusion. As my question was, why Khamstvo still here? Why in this new consumerist context, not in service, where is much less Khamstvo right now, not in ritual, collective ritual to subordinate a person to the special type of Soviet personality. It not exist, doesn't know. But Khamstvo is still there, and Khamstvo is there in the special institutional gendered side, maternity care. So from one side, Khamstvo is a cultural specific communicative practice on the level, on general level of society. This is one level, but it's shaped by a special combination of a specific institutional gender order. So it could exist in one institutional order, but could be seized in another institutional order. So its context, institutional context matter in order to understand why there is still Khamstvo. And so it is still there in maternity care as providers systematically juggle different style of emotional practice to force childbearing women to cooperate and to maintain institutional order. So doing this, they maneuver between market and mothers' individualistic consumer demands, state bureaucratic rules and concern about mothers as producers of population, and moral community concern about mothers' proper behavior. Something was already published, what I'm talking today about. And finally, there are some pictures about Khamstvo, and I would like to thank you for your attention. Thank you. And now I probably stop the demonstration. Yes? Should I stop the demonstration? Yes. Okay, good. I will.
Thank you so much. And I'd like to encourage members of our audience now to put questions into our Q&A box, and I will pose them to Anna Temkina as they come in. But while we wait for other questions to come in, I'll pose a couple of questions. One is, I think we talked about this at a panel at a conference in the fall when you presented similar work. But could you say a few words about how these emotional practices and regimes and these different institutional kind of forces and tensions interact with the kind of findings that you and people like Michelle Rifkinfish found about formal and informal means of, for example, personalizing healthcare provision through Pablatu, getting different kinds of informal networking methods that were certainly in the 90s and early 2000s quite widespread in these sectors. How does that intersect with, is that a means, for example, to manage Khamstvo-laden interactions with a healthcare provider?
Yeah, thank you. It's a very important question. And if to a little bit simplify, in Soviet time, and really Michelle Rifkinfish told about this, and our research also proves this, that blood and bribe, yes, and informal connection was the only one mechanism to overcome bribe, Khamstvo. There was no one more. Of course, person could be lucky and not to face Khamstvo, but a systematic mechanism, it was only one way, and it worked through personalization, as you're absolutely correct, through personalization, and then there was chance that there will be not more polite, but less Khamstvo. But the problem with maternity care in Soviet time and still in post-Soviet time, that there is no continuity in maternity care. There will be different doctors every shift, and they will change their shift. And so even if there will be informal agreement with one doctor, then next shift will be another doctor. And it is not organizationally possible to make informal relation or to give presents or to pay to everybody who will be around you. There will be dozens of personnel, maternity care, nurses, midwives, different doctors, anesthesiologists, neonatologists, pediatrics, and so on. And even you have one doctor who take care about you personally, there will be a lot of other persons who not in informal contract with you. So there is a very high chances that there still will be Khamstvo, even under this informal connection and informal payment and informal informal relation. Now, situation is much more complicated. There is commercial segment in maternity care, and when woman pay for her service, it's high price in Russia, and in St. Petersburg, around 30% of women, according to our research, pay for this commercial service. And then there will be one doctor who will take care for everything about you, or one midwife, much more often doctor, because legal responsibility is only of doctor in Russian. And then very often, women will tell us that they paid for their emotional security and for not to face Khamstvo, that their motivation to pay was not to face Khamstvo. And they more or less receive these results, but also it could not be not. If something will go wrong, then for sure it could be a quite different situation and this style of politeness and smile from this commercial segment, like a shift to free of charge. And so right now, legal norm, not legal norm, but norm, legitimate norm is to be polite with patient. But it in practice is very different. And even if there will be personalized relationships, paid or informal, nevertheless, the main task of doctor not to receive some sanction, not to overcome some rules, and to maintain institutional order. If women demands does not fit institutional order, then doctors will use any possibility this woman to fit. Because, for example, woman want to leave hospital. According to law, she could, but there will be so many punishment and so many trouble if she did. So will smile to her and explain that she did not do this. If this does not help, she will press on her, хамят, and explains that she is bad mother and her child will die. But the main reason, and they are sure that this is the reason, but the main reason is that woman could not make her own choice because doctors will be responsible and they will be sanctioned for this and they will be fined. And so this works now if there is payment or personalization, and payment lead to personalization. But every time there is nevertheless possibility that it will not work.
That's excellent. So we have a question. Elena Hoffenberg asks, and it's related to this point you were making just now. She asks, does maternal mortality or the risk of maternal death shape the emotional regimes and institutional order at play?
Yes, yes. This is this state concern. And every case of mother's death will be the huge problem for maternity hospital. We work in the site where such death happened because the site take the most complicated cases in the city. And so, of course, the most complicated led to higher average mortality to compare with the city. But every time doctors are in trouble. Even we ask them, it's expected you take the most complicated cases. And they said, yes, it expected, but nevertheless, we will be punished. They will find how to punish us in every case of maternity death. It's very rigidly controlled. And every case is under special contract, even if there was no clinical possibility to save this person. But nevertheless, it will be controlled as a main trouble as connected to this demographical concern. Mothers died, she will not give any birth, and so on. It's true, yeah.
We have another question from Angelina Ilieva, who asks, can you speak a little bit more about the different emotional regimes? What other regimes are in practice?
Yeah.
Maybe giving a little bit more detail about them and the question of, are there others besides these two major ones that you described?
Yes, it's an interesting question, because yes, there are no, if we elaborate first about what I already talked, is this Khamstvo as a way to control. Smiling is also the way of control, but quite different way of control. And when the smiling is more or less connected to consumerist context, and Khamstvo like between moralization and state control over maternity care. But there is, I think that there is one more regime, which I really just mentioned, but did not mention in my presentation, is effectively natural professionalism. That professional should not have emotion at all. And that professionals are affective natural, and real professional could control emotion. There should be no emotion, and that good professional service is service without emotions. And this for sure regime exists too, when there will be no Khamstvo, neither smile, there will be professional communication without emotion, but till something happened. Because when patient began outbursting emotionally and the professionals are not prepared for this, they all time complain to us in our site that they do not know what to do with the women's emotion. They're not trained, they're not prepared, nobody explains them what to do. Now they have psychologists, but there was only beginning of organization of psychological service within this hospital when we did our study. And so, for example, sometimes they delegate emotional work. For example, chief of department told about herself that she knows how to speak with women. And so then when something going wrong, she asked younger professional just to call for her because she could communicate, and she told that younger couldn't. They don't know how to communicate. And so then it is like this professionalism is emotionally free regime exists also, but it's also very fragile because they are not trained, they are not learned, even often they do not care about this. But it exists and developed nowadays in Russia.
That's fascinating. Our next question is from Susan Gall, who asks, it took a great deal of work, in fact, a complete feminist movement to get American gynecologists to display more respect for pregnant women in the US. Is there any movement among Russian women, perhaps in some classes rather than others?
Unfortunately, mostly women implement in Russia individualistic strategy, not collective. They struggle for good care individually. They mobilize their resources, they pay money, they find personal connection. This is not a kind of collective movement. And so they mostly press as consumers, not as citizens, no, in a broad sense, in citizens. But of course, there are signs, some traces of such collective organization. For example, I also analyze material of flash mob violence in delivery. where a lot of people wrote on internet their story about violence and delivery. It was not used before. Everybody speak about Khamstvo, not violence. Now language changes and they began to speak about violence and they share their stories. But nevertheless, nothing happened. Just, of course, there is another language. There is another level of reflection. There is even consciousness raising with this side, but still, and of course, maybe even due corona, when nobody care about consumer, and there were less complaint in Russia during COVID because it was mostly like to do professional job, and patient less complain and doctors less care about this, and so it's. So from one side, there is quite few movement with some feminist ideas. They exist in Russia, but quite few. And this насилие рода considers themselves as feminist. From the other side, there is a sign of some trace we found. I called it professional as political. When within professional groups, they began absolutely invisibly for outsider to change situation from below. They try to, and it's very often done through informal connection. When nurses have an informal connection, midwives have informal connection, doctors have informal connection, they have even their own seminar in Zoom, initiatively organized, and when they try to change this condition and to organize more professional, more patient-oriented service. But when we ask them, how do you manage to do this? And they say, oh, for example, our strategy is the following. I will write in record what I need to write, but I will do what I need to do really for patient. So there will be this discrepancy between formal records and their real practices. And this is very dangerous because if somebody will find out, it's of course, it's will be punished. But if it will be not correct recording, they will be punished either. So this is like between a different kind, but to summarize it briefly, it's very slowly developed in Russia. It developed, but very, very slowly.
Please, anyone else who wants to pose questions, please put them in the Q&A box. If you have trouble with that, you can also just put it in the chat as well. Another question, we were talking about this earlier, you're doing some additional projects related to,
I didn't listen now.
I'm curious about, what's that? I'm sorry, did I cut out? Could you give us a sense of just briefly what your sense is of the potential effects of COVID on this sphere of emotional regimes in healthcare or more broadly? Well, let's stick to healthcare in particular based on some of the other work you've been doing.
Okay, so yeah, in COVID, we did another research in COVID. We did interviews with medical professionals on the first stage of COVID, and also, and this is, once maternity care in COVID was like forgotten. When there was a reorganization of medical institutions, many of them were reorganized in COVID hospital in St. Petersburg, and there were resources and there were problems and there were trouble and so on. But maternity care exists as nobody care, as everybody forgot about maternity care, which was under very, very important state concern, but now it was not. It wasn't. So they restrict a little bit. They prohibited partners to come to hospital, and of course there were cases when there was COVID in maternity hospital, and this was their main concern. Now it was not about consumer demands. There was not about how to, because in COVID nobody fit institutional order. It wasn't possible. So this trouble became less important than safety of medical workers who were extremely of high level of contamination by COVID in Russia because they did not have enough equipment. But also this was once again the state paternalism, bureaucratic rigid rule did not give them opportunity, for example, to receive money from NKO and to buy masks by themselves because it's prohibited by the state. You could not use money as you want to use them. And so they were still under this restriction and a lot of this restriction. But with this emotional style, according to our research, that professionals and providers stop caring about patient. They care only about illness. If before COVID, consumer trend became more and more visible in Russia, and due to it, providers should care about emotion as well, about well-being, about emotion. Then COVID just stopped it because there was only the issue of illness, and neither providers care about patient, no patient demand to care them emotionally. It was like struggle against illness, not very successful very often because of organizational trouble in healthcare in Russia, but these regimes disappeared. Like smiling, and nobody cared about Khamstvo, nobody cared about smiling. It was just caring about institutional order will maintain, and it will recognize, and it will work. But I think that this will return when situation became more normal, more stable. It's just like crisis situation. But it could be reshaped, and it's very difficult to say in which direction emotional styles will be reshaped in after COVID healthcare or post-COVID healthcare.
I have another question about medical training and education, because one of the places I think you see in, for example, in the United States, a lot of emphasis on these kinds of issues of communicative styles, on bedside manner, is increasingly in medical school and in medical education, where there's been over the last 20 years a lot of talk about things like clinical empathy, about trying to train this as a kind of a set of capacities for physicians. And I'm curious whether do you see any of that going on in the medical education sphere in Russia?
It's look like that medical education is even more rigid system than healthcare. And it's still not I did not do special research on education, but as I see it consequences, it's there is not a lot of changes in this sense, but there is more and more request from professional about skills of communication. And when there are some seminars, there will be a lot of doctors on such seminars. When there will be section on the medical conference about communication and about, there will be a lot of doctors, there will be a lot of questions. There are special professionals in Russia who learned in Israel, for example, and they give a lot of lessons, a lot of training lessons, and there is a lot of requests for such training lessons. And it's absolutely initiatives which come from below when a lot of professionals want to have the skill. And now they will take that this is a part of professionalism. We should have communicative skills if we want to be professional. It's more or less common, but not, and there are, but then there should be like initiative from themselves. Nobody care a lot about they will be training about this, but they find themselves their possibility, but also in Russia now exist a lot of small initiatives, for example, like Foundation of Fomintsov, who work specially with oncologists and train oncologists, and they have lessons on communicative practice. And if there will be some new small semi-private schools for medical education, very small, but then for sure will be training in communication. So as in mainstream, let me say, there is not a lot of change, but in this niche around, there are a lot.
And then let's give a chance for anyone else who wants to pose questions. I'll ask one more, unless others come up with questions. Could you say a few words about it was interesting that your initial example of your own experience takes place outside of in a kind of a retail commercial setting. And I'm just curious about what's your sense of to what degree, how differently these kinds of emotional regimes are, communicative regimes are functioning in other domains outside of healthcare. I realize that's not where you're doing your research, but if you could say more.
In service, for sure, it's consumerist smile style. I think that it will be extremely rare in St. Petersburg to face a situation which I faced. It's possible, it's happened, but it's very, very rare. So service is more or less consumer smiling, politeness oriented. But institutions are very different, and it should, in any case, institution will differ one from another. And so this is very sociological work to be done in different institutions. And we have right now, we had recently some discussion with my Israeli colleagues who asked me, what about education? It is the same in education. As Khamstvo smiling, you consumer student oriented. And I did not research in this, but I'm a teacher, of course. And I said that I think that in education is a little bit different, you know, it's not so much about body, it's not, but they told no, it's the same in education. Of course, there are another forms, another configuration, but also I think that, of course, I said in a very broad sense, if we will have we have 2 private maternity hospitals in St. Petersburg, and if we will take there, we will find more or less smiling regime within them. If we will take private university, it will be another emotional regime. In the state university, huge, bureaucratic, it will be different. But in any case, I think there will be this market and state bureaucracy traces in these regimes. And for example, I have no idea what is the emotional regime in army, for example. Also, I think this is not heterogeneous and coherent. There should be different one.
Well, this is fascinating work. Thank you so much, Anna Temkina, for joining us today and for sharing this really interesting work. And I hope very much the next time we can host you in person in Chicago. And thank you so much to our attendees for joining so late in the academic year.
Okay, thank you so much for inviting, and I also hope that we will have possibility to meet face to face. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.